Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's virtually monthly uh, lecture online. And tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce or reintroduce to you Dr. Ian Byrne, who's recently enjoyed success with his doctorate on a cartographic analysis of oil company roadmaps. 1904 to 2004. So well done, Dr. Ian. And Ian's title of the talk tonight, with questions and answers afterwards, is Wherever You Go, You Can Be Sure of a Shell Map. Ian, take it away.
Right. In that case, I have to work out how to share, don't I? We didn't practice this first. It's okay. I know.
We got carried away.
Yeah, we got carried away. Am I now sharing?
Not yet.
I should now be sharing.
You are indeed.
Right. Thank you very much, everyone. And I will just move bits around the screen so I can control things a little bit easier whilst we're doing this. The subject tonight is wherever you go, you can be sure of a shell map, or if you prefer, everywhere you go, you can be sure of a shell map. The slogan, as you can see, comes from the Shell lorry bills of the 1930s. The one we have there is a 1932 lorry bill by the noted artist Graham Sutherland, and that uses the everywhere you go version. As a kid, I actually lived in Swanage, which is very close to the Great Globe, and everywhere we went, we didn't take an Ordnance Survey map, but we took a shell map. Or actually, if we went to France, we probably took a Michelin map, but I won't go into that. So that's why I'm choosing this particular topic. It also, I hope, is a little bit more focused than if I was to sort of try and run through too many of the maps that I have in my rather large collection of oil company road maps. And I'm by restricting it to Shell, I'm not sort of restricting it too much geographically, as we shall see. Essentially, the way I've set out tonight's talk is to try and run it more or less chronologically, although there'll be a few places where I go off-piste, of course, starting with some very early ones, but in doing so, also running through some of the many places that you might have been able to have found a shell map. And if people can see my background behind me on Zoom, that actually is the inside of a Shell filling station taken in January 1956, courtesy of the Upplands Museum in Sweden, of a station in Uppsala. And on the wall, just to the right of my earface, you will see, if I can get sort of roughly there, is a Shell map. Well, actually not a Shell map, but a map inside a frame that's headed Shell Uppsala. Not a printed map by Shell, but a map all the same. And we think that in the cabinet behind me, there were some more Shell maps for sale. Anyway, enough of the introduction. Let's start and see where the Shell map started. In the way of these things, thank you. In the way of these things, no one knows exactly when the first Shell map was published. Shell's, the earliest one I have in my collection is the one we've got shown here. It's dated 1924. You can see that, I think, if fairly clearly underneath on the front of the map. And it's actually really just an overprint of an official map issued by the Oregon State, what's it called? The automobile of the state of Oregon, and through trunk highways and main traveled roads. That particular copy has also been overprinted by Lentz Machine Shop, but that's a rubber stamp on the map. It's not printed on the original map. What is printed on the original map, as we can see on the rear cover, it says Compliments of the Shell Company of California. Shell California probably issued the first road maps bearing the Shell logo. We think that there's one from about 21 or 22. As I said, the one I have there is 24. There's known to be one from 23, but of Oregon. Sorry, of Washington State, rather, not Oregon. But it's a proper Shell map because Shell overprinted both sides with advertising slogans. And as we can see around the city of Portland, we have slogans that would have been quite similar to the ones used in the UK at the same time. So we have Shell motor oil for dependable lubrication. A trial will convince. Shell gasoline for dominant power. That's actually a different one. And this fall and winter used Shell winter quality quick starting gasoline. And the Shell posters that were sold in the UK, or not sold, that were produced in the UK in much the same area, tended to promote Shell quick starting gasoline and oil, or petrol and oil, the quick starting pair. So that's a good pair to start with. Moving on just a few years, the Shell Company of California didn't just overprint someone else's map, it actually had a bespoke produced map. And this one, dated 1925, shows not just a fairly small Shell logo on the front, but it does actually say on the front that it's the Shell Company of California. And on the back, we see a list of towns and cities where there were Shell stations in Northern California. I have a very similar map for Southern California, but issued a few years later. But stylistically, it's almost identical. And a feature which I particularly like on oil company maps, we see that towns or cities where there's a Shell station are coloured red. So I'm circling Bakersfield, and we'll see that at that stage, it wasn't quite everywhere you went that you would find a Shell station, but certainly a lot of places. Shell at the time had 3 operating companies in the US, as well as the California company. There was an East Coast company, and then in the middle, they had a company called Roxana Petroleum. Over in Europe, there were also beginning to be Shell stations. And here we see an early map from the Netherlands. This is of the middle of the Netherlands. I'd like you to sort of think about what we might see down here in the bottom right-hand corner of the map, where we have a fair bit of water in the Zuiderzee, just to the east there of Amsterdam. We might see something different later on. This is not, by my reckoning, probably really a Shell map. It was issued again by the Automobile Club, and it had this wonderful, very 1920s picture on the back. We don't know the exact date, but it's around sort of late 20s, early 30s. The Netherlands was covered in 3 sheets, basically north, south, and central. And this is as I said, this is the central sheet. But it wasn't just advertising for Shell on this map. Inside the cover, there was an advert for Philips lights. And I suppose that's the sort of the 2 great companies associated with the Netherlands and the motor industry. Philips for the lights, and Shell for the petrol and oil. In 1928, Shell started being one of the co-sponsors of a series of maps of metropolitan France. 5 titles were produced in 28, 5 more in 1929, and at least 4 more in 1930, plus an additional 3 sections covering Algeria. This is the one of Alger. It's not Algeria as a whole, but it's just the central section. And then there's one on another one of Constantine, and a third one, I think, of Beaune. This, although it carries advertising from companies other than Shell, including, for example, Dunlop, Société Générale, Le Réseau d'État, which actually promotes its ferries to Dover for London, and the Touring Club de France, the predominant advertiser with this wonderful panel of advertising was indeed Shell. And I actually have 2 copies of this map. I have the version we see here, which very prominently in the right-hand side says it was offered by Shell, it was given away by Shell. And I have a second copy that doesn't have that printing on it. So I would regard this as being a genuine Shell map, because it was not only carrying advertising from the company, but it was also given away by the company. But the map we see is very high quality. It was produced by the Cartographical Institute of the Army, which did a lot of the main mapping in that era on behalf of the French state. So we've now seen Shell maps okay from USA, Europe, and even North Africa. If we go back across the Atlantic, Shell was also very active in countries such as Canada. This is a fairly simple cartography, definitely when we compare it to the one we've just seen of Algeria. And it's produced by, of Ontario. The cover design was, however, for the first time in 1930, unified across all 4 operating shell companies in North America. And so it didn't matter whether it was California or New York or somewhere in the middle of the US, or for that matter, as we see here, Ontario, they used the same basic design. And it's only at the bottom where it says compliments to the Shell Company of Canada Limited. And if there was any doubt about the year, this one's an easy one to date. We see a sort of a meme that was very common in road maps in the 1930s of sort of 2 people sitting in an open-top tourer. Sometimes they're shown in front of petrol pumps. Occasionally, they're even shown receiving maps. And sometimes it's just one person or even a lady and her dog, as on the 1933 covers used across North America. These are very popular. They're much, as I put there, they're very sought after by collectors, but they were also produced in absolutely vast quantities. So they're actually quite easy to come across these still these days, even though they're now over 90 years old. They did a couple of variations with the so-called license plates 33 and 34, but the 33 ones we see here are the most attractive. And we see now also that the maps inside have turned into rather more colors. They're not just the basic maps. They've gone to a fairly colorful design. The actual road map element was as well. I mean, here I've actually showing just an extract from the Century of Progress, showing the pavilions that were associated with that event in Chicago. Another feature which we shall see probably quite a few times this evening is the fact that we tend to have a red or a red and yellow or similar border outline to the map, a little bit set inside from the edge of the actual physical paper, with a Shell logo in the corner. And that Shell logo with the red background could be seen still across much of the world right up until 1971. I said, Shell were found in several places, several continents. They were found in Australasia as well. They were quick to develop and become one of the largest companies in Australia. But they didn't tend to issue standard sheet maps in the early years. They tended, because frankly, if you issued a sheet map of an Australian state, it would be mainly full of nothing, maybe a few sheep and rabbits, with just the odd road running across and the odd settlement. So recognizing that, they tended to concentrate either on strip maps, giving the overland routes between leading cities. And we see on the left a 1931, I think it is, covering Melbourne to Sydney. And on the right, we see the other thing that they tended to do, which is where there was perhaps rather greater density of places to go. They would issue a booklet of motor tours. I have several examples. None of them look remotely similar. 1 or 2 of them are even hardback. Others are really little more than a few maps stapled into a light card cover, as in the Tasmania one there. Sorry, I'm not reading my own screen, am I? It says it's a 1932 Melbourne-Sydney map and a 1937 map or motor tours booklet of Tasmania. So let's come back to Europe and have a look at some more random European ones. In 1930s, Germany issued around 20 sectional maps and up to 90 city maps. As we can see, they were very attractive in terms of covers, and they had reasonably good cartography inside. I don't think I've got an example of the inside of one of the regional maps, but they were quite good quality maps, and again clearly marked locations or towns and cities where there were Shell stations. On the right we see a map of Breslau. I've chosen this one for a reason you'll see a bit later on. This does also mark where there were places there were Shell so-called Zapfstellen, which were like sort of pumps on the sidewalk. There's one there, there's another one up here, and then there's one just in front of the station. And we see the River Oder running through. But this is mid-1930s, and although you probably can't see it on screen, if you could, you would spot that that was the Adolf Hitler Strasse. And Shell maps were already having to reflect the political changes that were taking place in Germany. Shell didn't just issue city maps and regional maps. They issued river and holiday area maps. There was about a couple of dozen of those. And they issued so-called touring maps. And yes, that is indeed map number 334/335. I think the highest I've got is about 397. So there were just about 400, although not quite so many sheets and pieces of paper. And some of the titles were recycled as they went through the series. The river and holiday maps are, however, really quite beautiful productions with insets of various features and also, of course, insets of the odd shell pump. They were recognized as such. They contained information on the back, but I also have a bound volume of the set in white Morocco leather and numbered issue number 48. I don't know how many were printed. It's very hard to guess, but I suspect it was probably only hundreds rather than thousands. There were, there were also a few non-series maps, that, such as a cruising guide or a weather map. So altogether, at their peak, I suspect that Shell were probably producing something about 325 or 330 maps at any one time. As I said, the numbering on the touring maps goes a bit higher, but they were not all issued at once. But I mentioned in the previous one the winds of change coming through politically. And with the Anschluss and with the expansion of Nazi Germany, shell maps were expected, like everyone else's maps, to keep up with the time. So at the bottom left there, we see a 1938 map, which shows Austria has been sort of merged into Nazi Germany. But of course, at that point, Shell hadn't actually managed to produce any maps for it. By the map dated 1939, which is on the right, they had renumbered the entire series and they were covering all of Austria within the series. So this is Tyrol, which would, of course, previously have been regarded as part of Austria, not as part of Germany. But there are various versions of this map with different arrangements on the rear cover. This is the final version before the war broke out, where they're actually showing that they've completely annexed Moravia and Czechia, the Sudetenland, and it has been covered by maps. So a somewhat chilling reminder that companies tended to have to bow to the prevailing things of their time. Over in France, Shell had developed, however, a long-lasting relationship with a company called Foldex. Foldex was established by an entrepreneur and had come up with a novel way of actually producing maps that folded slightly differently, with the intention being it was a bit easier to find your way around a set of maps. The Foldex map we see here is no later than 1939. It's in sort of ready-to-card covers, and we can date it because the maps have grey main roads, a rather unusual color choice even for France. I have a 1940 map in the same series that is dated, and it has red main roads. So we know that that gives us a limit on the date of this undated map. It's also noticeable, you'll see that this particular one has a sticker over the original French price for 2 shillings and 6pence. Foldex maps were highly detailed. I think in many cases they were far too detailed and actually quite cluttered with information. But one of the things that meant was that Shell would regularly allow them to be sold in other countries through normal booksellers and normal the normal book trade, rather than being just available through Shell service stations. This section number 1 is very hard to read. That says Belgique Nord in sort of very stylized writing. The following edition, the 1940 edition, they'd flipped the title to Nord Belgique. I'm not quite sure why, and I'm also quite surprised that there was actually an issue dated 1940 that was published, but there was. And as we can see from the sort of outline map on the cover, it did actually cover the entirety of Belgium, as well as a reasonable bit of northern France or northeastern France, scale at 1 to 400,000. Not unsurprisingly, there was then a gap in the publishing of maps. Commercially published road maps were very rare through the war years. There were a few in the USA. One or two companies were specifically permitted to issue maps, and often had to put sort of certain omission or make certain omissions where there were military facilities. So it wasn't until the late 1940s, early 1950s that the commercial road map and ones by oil companies such as Shell re-emerged. This is a post-war. From the cover design, it's probably about 53 or 54. And it's again a sectional map of France. And as we can see, little bits of the main roads are now, of course, red, not grey. What it also shows, not terribly clearly, is I've actually scanned it opened across so you can see the different sections, which is sort of almost like a concertina getting narrower each time, which was the patent that Foldex had to try and make it easier to show for you to locate where you were trying to go on a road map. I personally don't think it particularly worked. It meant they had to use very thin paper, which was then prone to tearing. But surprisingly, it was actually a reasonable quality. So even though you will often find maps that have from the 30s through to the 50s that have torn, the actual paper itself generally has been well preserved. It's not high acid or anything. As I think I've put on the previous screen, you can find shell maps of this variety from a whole number of European countries. I've got examples from countries such as Norway and Sweden, as well as the UK itself. Obviously, we've got France here, but it turned up in other places as well. And indeed, the photograph of the Shell garage in Sweden that I have behind me is from a series of photographs available from that particular museum. And on one of the photographs, I'm fairly certain I can see a small pile of Shell Foldex maps sitting inside a cabinet. But Shell wasn't just about Europe and North America and Australia. It went to other places as well. So here's a couple of shells from South America. Both used local cartography rather than a corporate style. And in fact, both used a rather unusual cover design for Shell. The one on the left is Maracaibo, second city in Venezuela, and I think a very important map, a very important place to map because of the fact that the large quantities of oil were discovered there in the 1950s. And I suspect that the companies who issued maps of places like that were often trying to ingratiate themselves to the local government and to the local bigwigs to actually put themselves in a good position when it came to bidding for contracts to drill. On the right is a map of Cuba, pre-Fidel Castro, of course, but an unusual map from Shell's viewpoint because the style of the map we see on the right here is actually identical to that produced for Esso and its subsidiaries and not for Shell. So at some point, a local cartographer who's credited on the map had probably borrowed the design from Esso and then applied it to a Shell map. And that extends even to the extent that whereas the Maracaibo map has red and yellow around the edge of the map, which is typical for Shell, the Cuba map has blue, which would be typical for Esso. Since we're in the mid-50s, a quick aside, these maps are both dated from 1956, and it sort of gives you a sense alphabetically of where we might be going. If you want to go wherever you go, well, we can go from Aalborg to Zurich. Actually, I also have a map of Aachen, which would come before Aalborg, but somehow the Aalborg map was a bit more interesting with that lovely water tower on the cover. And of course, the ubiquity means just occasionally, if you pick up a Shell map of X, you might not be quite sure where it's going to be of. Here are two Shell maps of Victoria, but as we can see, they're very different Victorias. On the left, it's Victoria, BC. On the right, it's Victoria, Australia. Also 1956. we're sort of entering peak shell map era at this level, where you find maximum both in terms of titles and in numbers of maps. By the end of the 50s, the Foldex maps were seen as being far too expensive and not a good solution. So individual countries tended to go their own route. In the UK, that meant going with with George Philip and Son. In France, they actually kept to Foldex to do the cartography, but produced a completely different design, a completely different concept, something called a cartoguide. And on one side, you had a usable map, 1 to 500,000, although it doesn't usually say so on the cover, or in fact, even anywhere on the map at all. And on the reverse, sort of little thumbnails of what you might find of interest to a tourist in each of the towns covered by it. The early cartoguide came in quite attractive sort of wallets. This is a set, and in fact, each of the characters we see here in regional dress appears on the reverse of the relevant cartoguide. So there are 13 characters, one for each of the 13 cartoguide. Later, they just went to vinyl plastic covers, which were by comparison obviously very boring. The other thing that in the early ones, we will see that they had little inset drawings of points of interest. So here's Mont Saint-Michel, for example. And here we have something at, can I read where it is? No, I can't. I can say it's Rennes, but I don't think it is Rennes. No, Rennes down here, isn't it? Anyway, again, later cartoguide missed these off and just were a little bit simpler. But one thing that cartoguide tended to have were attractive covers at the start. They kept this design, they changed the top a little bit for quite a few years, and then there was a whole sequence of different designs. So if I can just move out of chronological sequence to stay with the cartoguide, here we see sections 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 from the years indicated below. I have to say, I don't know what the person was smoking when they designed the 1980 cover, but I certainly wouldn't want to have been there in the vicinity. Each cover was unique to the particular area covered. So this horrible 1980 design has different color combinations, most of which are about as mind-blowing as that one. The earlier ones were a lot nicer, I hasten to add. And by 1984, it had become very, very utilitarian again and not very interesting at all. Inside, the maps were obviously regularly updated, but were essentially the same design as we saw, minus the little images from the 1958 version. We've looked also in the late 1950s, Shell tended to produce common design of cover, or more or less common design of cover. So the one on the right, Yugoslavia, where of course Shell didn't actually have an operating company at all, was the standard design. Occasionally they came out with a grey background rather than a light green background. The one on the left of Vietnam is a variant on the same theme, but actually is a little bit different. It's not quite the same, although it's clearly linked in style. The two images on the left are from the Vietnam map. We see the town of Hue, and we also see that although the map was described as Vietnam, the very top of the map, this is as far north as it went, was effectively the dividing line between North and South Vietnam. So it's something of a misnomer. It is actually only South Vietnam. Some of you will be aware of the fact that as well as sort of slogans like everywhere you go, you can be sure of Shell, the other great slogan that Shell has used for many, many years is "Go well, go Shell." This actually has a Vietnamese equivalent. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it, but if you read what's there, it sounds a bit like "Go well, go Shell," but it's using Vietnamese words. Keeping to sort of some of the one of the more Asian locations on the left again, we have a set of shell maps of Japan. These are dated, or maybe not dated, they're 1960s. There's because they have this particular interlocking arrows, we can say they're probably very late 50s or early 60s. I think they're early 60s. And they're very grey maps with very little colour on them, but they do actually have little colour logos where the shell stations are. They also have contours for the mountains, which is very unusual. So that you probably can see, may not, depends on how, if you've got a poor zoom connection, you may not see it very clearly, but there are grey contours to give the landforms of the mountains here, which of course is in complete contrast to the hill shading and colouring that was used on a Halwag-derived shell map of Switzerland, specifically in this case, northeast Switzerland, and two very different ways of showing mountainous territories. One of the sections in the show was Metropolitan Toronto. The rest covered split the country up into about 5 fairly logical sections. Another slightly exotic location to find a shell map is the Sahara. I'm not sure whether that map would be much use if you were attempting to drive across the Sahara. It does go all the way down. And I suspect it's perhaps rather colourful rather than practical. But partout au Sahara, everywhere in the Sahara, everywhere you go, you will see a shell. And I suspect that actually in the Sahara, you may well have still found quite a few of these old-fashioned hand pumps on the top left of the station of the cover, as well as the more modern 1950s style pumps. That's actually a 61 map. It was the second reprinting. I suspect it was fairly popular as a freebie rather than as a practical device. In the early 1960s, I mentioned earlier that there was a commonality of cover design. This was because there was a Shell touring service. And if I can just take one step away from Shell maps for a moment and look at what you might find from the Shell's touring service, you could write and send away, and you would get a Shell touring holdall, i.e. a cardboard folder, with certain things inside. So this is retail selling prices of motor fuels and oils in pretty well all the main countries of Western Europe. To its right, we have a 6-language phrase book. Again, you probably can't see terribly clearly, but that's the bottom of the phrase book. So it's a smaller format. There's a complement slip, which notes that it comes from Shellmex and BP Limited, which of course was the operating company in the UK. Quite surprisingly, because you'd written to Shell, you got one back from Shellmex and BP. If you wrote to BP, you'd get one back from BP, and it would be very different. In fact, dare I say it, the BP one was generally a lot better and had a lot more interesting information in terms of, apart from the basic maps. And finally, here we have a Shell Map Pocket computer, maybe not quite your latest iPhone, but designed to be able to give you conversions between miles and kilometers or gallons and liters, or I think Celsius and Fahrenheit on the back, and a couple of other things as well. I think there were 5 conversions on one of these nice slidey things. I always like those. They turn up on a few road maps to give distances as well, but that one doesn't. And what might you find in terms of the maps? Well, a remarkable degree of similarity in basic design in terms of the covers of the maps. Inside, they would tend to have local cartography, or maybe, as in the case of Nigeria, it would be cartography by George Phillip again. The people in Iceland hadn't quite got the message, and theirs doesn't quite fit into the pattern. But again, you can see the clear relationship between them. And I guess there's a sense also that wherever you go, you could indeed get a shell map, because you've got sort of Nigeria, Sweden, Iceland, northern Italy. Shell would produce a few more specialist maps of particular tourist regions. Here, same basic cover design with a very basic map of Greece, designed as camping in Greece. I'm not sure really it would be much use if we were trying to find a campsite. And it does have the wonderful statement on it that this map should not be considered as a road map. I'm never quite sure what it should be considered as in that case, but it's a nice little freebie, and it's colourful. I was trying to find, and I couldn't find one of the weirdest maps of all, which is a shell map of Corfu, which has a photograph of a model of a Shell station on the cover, which looks like it was homemade by the owner of the garage. It's very strange. Of course, Greece and Turkey were and remain to some degree arch rivals, but shell crossed that border quite happily and had a very basic series of maps. I've got a couple of them listing or showing the route for the strip to go between particular locations. I'm sorry, where I've scanned that one. I've scanned that one as it unfolded rather than bother turning the scan around, so north is not the right direction. Doesn't show much along the way apart from where the shell stations were, but I guess that's something, because a familiar sign in a rather less familiar place, perhaps. In the 60s, Shell expanded. It acquired a number of other companies, and in the US, it also had a very large series of over 50 different maps, maybe actually probably about 80, I haven't got counted, of different locations, cities, states. Here on the left, we see a Shell map of Milwaukee. I just chose because it randomly came to hand, I think. The style on the right, we see one from a subsidiary of Shell that it acquired in Canada in the late 1950s. By 1962, it might even be 64, whenever it was, it had actually adopted the Shell map design, but for White Rose, its trading subsidiary. A couple of years later, the White Rose name was dropped and all the stations were switched to Shell. And we can see in both cases, as I pointed out in the 1930s map and then the Maracaibo map, we have sort of like red and yellow and bordering the map. Very classic Shell design there. And a fairly typical North American map inside. Somewhat based more on solid lines rather than using cased roads that we would find in Europe. And of course, I mentioned before an example where you might find a problem of asking for a shell map and getting the wrong place. Here's a US style of Norfolk, and here's a very definitely Shell BP shilling guide to Norfolk. As another example where Shell was so everywhere that you would actually find that you could have two Shell maps apparently at the same place that were definitely not the same place. As far as I'm aware, Shell never produced a map of Portsmouth. The Shell BP guide maps, basically it's mainly text in the booklet, are unusual that they're at the metric scale of 1 to 500,000. The US maps will only ever quote scales at miles to the inch, but actually a lot of the time, if you then convert the miles to the inch, they turn out also to be a metric scale. And if you're wondering why there's a Norwegian and a Dutch, get the around, what are they? An Icelandic, a Greek, a German, and a Danish flag on the front, that's because it's actually where in Norfolk they have the headquarters of the NATO Marine Service, the Marine NATO headquarters, which is what the photograph is of. So if you can ask me the questions, where is the only place that the map that I have that has both a Greek and an Icelandic flag on the cover? Norfolk, Virginia is probably not the place you would guess. Two more Shell maps. Again, you can see a similarity in design on the one on the left and design of the cover, although the map is very, very basic. It's of Defence Housing Society. Now, is there anyone who can put a hand up very quickly and tell me where the Defence Housing Society is or was? I don't see any immediate responses. In case you're not familiar with it, it's actually Karachi in Pakistan. And that's a Burma Shell logo. They used the Burma Shell name in a joint venture in Pakistan and in most, but not all, of India. When you got into the northeast of India, Burma operated through a separate company which used BOC as its brand name. But that, anyways, is a Burma Shell map, but it's kind of like an honorary Shell map of the Defence Housing Society. And the reverse side of that map is actually of the equally hard to locate KDA. I'm not quite sure what KDA stands for, other than the fact the K probably stands for Karachi. On the right, we have a shell map of Hong Kong, Kowloon, and the New Territories. I don't unfortunately have any shell maps of China to show you. Shell maps of China were issued in about 2010, but I've never managed to get my hands on one. I have seen pictures of them, so I know they exist. And that was about the time that the Chinese market, Shell was operating in a number of joint ventures with Sinochem and PetroChina. And I would very much like to get hold of one. So if anyone happens to just know where I can find a shell map of a region of China, please let me know. Anyway, sorry, coming back to the map we have here, this is Hong Kong, and we can see it's influenced very much by the English way you would draw maps, or the English style of maps. There's a sort of a slight sense of Phillips cartography about that bottom. And the sort of the plan of, well, it could be Victoria again, when in fact it is actually central, is rather similar. Similar design of cover, but another equally unlikely location is the shell across the Nalaba map. This is largely composed of a number of strips. It's a long way across the Nalaba, and it has exciting features marked on it, such as where you will cross the rabbit fence. And on the scan, it's not terribly clear, but this is the Gulf, the sea here, and this is the Aboriginal reservation, or sorry, Aboriginal reserve, which was actually sort of coloured in green. And it tells you where you can find water and other useful things if you're mad enough to want to drive across the Nalaba. Again, I suspect that's a map that may well have been sold in much larger quantities than people who actually drove along it. Right, well, where weren't Shell? Well, of course, Shell weren't in Eastern Europe or Russia at the time because, well, it was the Iron Curtain. Except, of course, they were. And around 1964, Shell were permitted to open a single filling station in Budapest as part of the sort of slight easing up after the earlier Russian invasion in 1958. And as we can see from the map extract on the left, all roads lead to Shell, or they certainly lead to that particular location. And we see various things, and we have this lovely cover on the front where we have a woman who sort of looks like she's sort of trying to mimic Audrey Hepburn or someone like that, in her open sports car with the right region, not the Karlsbrook. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of it. The main bridge in the centre of Budapest, and the old town up behind it, behind her. She's obviously taking a pause on her way to the Shell station, where, amongst other things, the information tells us that there's an espresso bar that you can actually relax whilst you're refueling your car. A few years later, by about 1970, it had been so successful that Shell were actually allowed to operate about 10 stations in Hungary. And here we have a postcard, and that's all that it is, and it's actually like a postcard on the reverse, that you could send all your friends. So you could say, look, I've been to the Shell stations in Hungary. Let's go back to Africa because we haven't been there for a little while. And here are two very contrasting maps of Africa. Local mapping was quite difficult, so oil companies, and in particular Shell, and Mobil actually, were very often the people who would produce maps of places that other cartographers didn't go, or other companies didn't go. On the left is a Senegal. It's a carte guide representing, because it's French West Africa, and we saw the carte guide earlier. It's the same physical dimensions as the French carte guide, but it wasn't included in the packets if you've got a set of the carte guide. On the right, we have the sort of the zigzag covers that were widely used by Shell in the late 60s and early 70s. This one's of Uganda. Cartography inside really was by George Philip and Son in this particular instance. And we have a rather nice depiction of Mount Elgon, which is on the border between Uganda and Kenya. But I have this map design cover for a number of locations. And in fact, after the meeting we had a couple of weeks ago, someone sent me a scan of the equivalent map of Ethiopia, which actually I've got a copy of already. But generally in most of most of Eastern Africa, not just the East Africa Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, or Tanzania subsequently. But in most of the countries on the eastern half of the continent, you would be able to get a shell map of that general design with sort of, sorry, go away word, I didn't ask you to start. Thank you. But as I said, I like the hypsometric tinting that we have there. And we've not yet been to New Zealand, so I thought I would just throw in a New Zealand and as well as a South Africa map. Moving forward in time, we now have the new shell logo, the simplified shell logo, which was introduced around 1972. And around the time of the 73 oil shock, suddenly oil companies looking very carefully at whether things were profit centers or whether they were costing them money. And if they were costing them money, they didn't do them. So the US maps more or less dropped, as we'll see in a moment. And where maps continued, they were often put into things that could be sold at a much higher price. The sticker on the Shell Road Atlas of Southern Africa is, I believe, an original sticker from the shop where it was overpriced the original printed price, rather than one that some secondhand bookshop has stuck on top of it. And they would often, because they were selling them at a higher price, they would often put a few extra things in, such as strip maps here on the left, or a travel time map, or as I sometimes like to think of it, as a time travel map, where we can go back and sort of see what New Zealand was like in 1979. Some of these maps can be quite difficult to date because they have often have a license date where they were issued with a government license. For example, the Shell license date on, the license date on the Southern Africa map is 1970, but I know the map is later simply because they hadn't designed that logo in 1970. They were still using the red background one with the shell across the center. As I said, the North American maps more or less came to a grinding halt in the early 70s. That's the last shell map I have from Canada. I think it was done a couple of years longer. It's produced for shell by a company called Creative Sales Corporation. And in the archive of the rival Rolf McNally cartographers, there's a very sniffy comment that they don't like that cartography. It is too congested. And to be honest, I agree with them. On the right, we have a very late 1983. Shell stopped issuing maps for general purposes in the early 70s, but the Shell Motorist Club would still send one out to its members. That's about as late as they went. The map inside is by H.M. Goucher, and it's absolutely identical to a map that I have by the US Tourist Board that was supplied to potential visitors to the USA in the same era from the UK. But Shell continued to issue maps in rather stranger locations. Here we have two from Southern Africa. We have a Shell map of Lüderitz. When I first picked up that, I had to look on an atlas to find out where Lüderitz was. It's on the coast of what's now Namibia, which I think at the time was still just about Southwest Africa. And it's unusual in that not many maps have their information in English, German, and Afrikaans. On the right, we have a rather more recent 2004 shell map of, I'll try and pronounce it, Kgalagadi, which is one of the wildlife national parks in Botswana. Shell have a long-running arrangement with a lady called Veronica Roth to support the publication of maps of national parks. They are pretty well the only maps bearing the Shell logo that you could still get more or less current editions of anywhere in the world. I said before sheet maps were going out of fashion. One of the last countries to still produce them occasionally was the Australian subsidiary. They issued a series in 1991, which included Papua New Guinea, which is always a nice place to have a map of. And again in 1996, we see there the one from Adelaide. And as we can see, the Papua New Guinea map was actually broken down into lots of little bits for the various areas where there were roads that you could potentially drive along. Whoops. Sorry, I've pressed too many times there, never mind. On the left, we have a shell map of Sheerland. Again, I'm never sure how you pronounce that. And you see there's the extract map from Copenhagen. Yes, you could argue that's a bit over congested too, particularly with the Shell logos dotted on top. I went into a service station in Denmark in late 1990s, can't remember exactly when, and was surprised to find it didn't only have the map of Sealand, it had a map of Sealand. And Sealand, of course, is the German equivalent. So there we have two shell maps. But delight of delights, they have a third as well of the completely unexpected location of Sealand. Not Zealand, which is what I thought it would be called, but Sealand. And that's a map of Sealand, Lolland, Falster, Mon, and Bornholm. So everything else is okay, but it's only that. And even better, they didn't just have that, but as you might have hoped, they had a map of North Jutland, all one word, and a map of South Jutland, all one word, Funen and Islands. That's the sort of map I really like to find. Suddenly you can't go into Shell stations any longer and find them. But early in my collecting day, you could just occasionally sort of find luck upon really unusual and really unlikely titles such as those. I dread to think how many copies they must have pulped of those, probably about 90% of what they printed. Because by the 1990s, British tourists were not generally taking cars to Denmark. So the demand for an English language map would be very, very low. Shell also occasionally did cross-border issues, but by the late 1960s had developed a partnership to replace the Foldex partnership with a company called Mayrs Geographische in Stuttgart. And they would produce maps of all sorts of places branded with Shell on the cover, but actually largely for sale through two sources. Firstly, through Shell stations in Germany, but also through places elsewhere, including WH Smith in the UK. Here are two quite late examples. On the left, we have the Shell of Gus, not in case anyone thinks it's Great Universal Stores, but of the Commonwealth of Independent States in its German acronym. And here we're sort of a bit hedging our bets because it's a Shell Eurocard, but it's also Marco Polo. These days they've dropped Shell as the branding, but still use Marco Polo and Eurocard and various other things. And on the right, we have a Shell map of Romania, probably rather a long way from its home. But I regard that as a genuine Shell map because not only does it say Shell on the cover and everything, but as you might be able to see from the sticker here, it was bought in a Shell station in Bucharest. I just happened to be in Bucharest and wandering into a Shell station, as one does. And there in the Shell Select shop, they had this road map. So I snapped it up because it was clearly a Shell Bucharest, or Romania rather. This one is interesting because the combining of the sections 2 and 3 into a single map, effectively back to back, makes me wonder if it was actually done primarily for use by Shell in Ukraine, because the two sections together more or less cover Ukraine, although you can see they don't quite cover the south of it. They don't cover Crimea, for example. And otherwise, I'm not quite sure why they chose to do that, but it might just have been an estimate of sales or something that did it. So we're beginning to get to a period where any Shell maps tend to be of rather stranger locations. A lot of the time, they were not even published by corporate Shell, but by local franchises. So on the left, we have a Shell map of Aruba, Netherlands Antilles, so a fairly logical place for Shell to be present. And that was published by the Barlock Caribbean Oil Corporation. They sold out, and the same map was later recycled without the Shell stations printed on it as a coastal map from an American oil company brand when Shell sold their refinery in Aruba. On the right, we have a real outlier, which is a black oil company sponsored map of ATV and OHV trails. ATVs, all-terrain vehicles. I'm not actually sure what OHV stands for, of southeastern Utah. But black oil were just, and their associated out west food and fuel convenience stores were just one of several sponsors on the map. I think if I had taken that map, I could have got $10 off staying at the Big Horn Lodge, I didn't. In fact, I don't think I've ever been there, so no, because it's been a you two have not been to. Shell did, through their operating companies, though, still produce maps in some limited areas quite late on. These are both Eastern Europe. We're now well after the fall of the Iron Curtain. On the left, we have Wrocław. I asked you to try and bear in mind the map from Breslau. Yes, it's the same image, although it's a photograph rather than a drawing, but it's the same building on the front. And of course, what was Adolf Hitler's Strasse has been renamed as Adama. I can't remember what it goes, Miss something or other. I'm not very good on Polish. So there is a map of where, in fact, looking at it, there's virtually no streets, even the sort of the ones that you might have thought would be non-controversial, like Goethe, have the same name. They've all been changed. Shell were particularly strong on interest on issuing or selling maps in Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, and Hungary. And on the right, we have a Czech edition of Vienna, which has does actually tell us it's Vienna or Wien in quite small letters, but it likes to tell us in Czech and Slovak that it's Wieden or Wien. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce those again. These sort of maps tend never to turn up in the UK. I was lucky to be in several of these countries at the right time to find them. And not just Shell maps, other companies were issuing maps as well. But they are quite, I think they were producing quite small quantities. And finally, we're getting towards the very end of my talk and the very end of the Shell maps. In Chile, you could still find very recently maps from the main Chilean company, Copec, broken down as sections. This, however, is the last Shell map that I'm aware of, which is 2011. And it does actually mark service stations again, but not with little shells this time, with sort of a sort of stylized petrol pump. But being a map of Chile, of course, like all good maps of Chile, it has to have the obligatory map of Chilean claims to the Antarctic. It's not quite to the extent of Copec, who actually issue a complete map of the Antarctic, just in case you feel like trying to ship your car over there and drive around. But somewhere on the map, we have an inset showing the region of Magellan and the Antarctic Chilean province of Antarctic Chile, to translate approximately. Again, it's the companies bowing to local expectations of the government, which I referred to earlier, which I'm afraid almost all commercial companies seem to do from time to time. And to finish, here are two most recent Shell maps in my collection. The most recent sheet map comes, in some ways not unsurprisingly, from the Netherlands. It's the 36th edition of the Grote Ortekaart van Nederland, that covers the entire country. So it's not quite the same area as the early one I showed, which only covered a third of the country. They slimmed the scale down in order to keep costs under control about 2005. So the final ones are at 1 to 300,000. Earlier ones are larger scale. And where on the early map I showed you, there was a nice bit of the Zuiderzee, now we have Almere and Lelystad, although that was actually off the other map. Almere was certainly on the other map. Milton Keynes twin town, in case anyone's wondering, which you're probably not. And the latest dated Shell map of any sort is a very impressive, that I'm aware of, is a very impressive hardback atlas. Cost me an arm and a leg. It's the 70th edition Jubilee edition. And it's the 70th Jubilee edition because it got a few pages at the front of it telling you all about the history of Shell maps in Germany, and other things, and actually including all sorts of photographs that have nothing to do with Germany. But this is indeed a 1950s German Shell map. Of course, it too would be in exactly the same colors. It would be in the bright red down here and in the yellow up here. And I guess that's another reason why shell maps are quite interesting, because there is this commonality of design features that run all the way through from, that bright red was on that very first 1924 overprint map. So there's a degree of stylistic references that run through. Not, they vary a great deal, but there is this commonality. And of course, I've got many more countries that I haven't had time to show you, different places. You might have spotted that, with the exception of Wrocław and Breslau, no two of the maps are actually covering the same area that I've shown you today. They've all been different areas. But as a catch-all, here's a Shell bunker map from 1959, which shows pretty well everywhere else where you could get Shell petrol and oils, or rather Shell bunker fuel, if you were driving around in a sort of a big ship or whatever. So hopefully I have proved that almost everywhere you can go, you can be sure of a Shell map. How are we on time? Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm 2 minutes over the time I said I'd be, so hopefully that's okay. And with that, I will say, are there any questions? I can try and link the YouTube, but it's probably not worth it. Maybe at the end when we stop recording, we can go that. And I see I have one message in chat, and apologies for not having spotted that early. Off-highway vehicle. Thank you. That's what OHV stands for.
Sorry, I missed that myself too. Well, what a romp. Thank you, Ian, very much indeed. We'll certainly invite everyone to have questions. And Fraser Donaghy is there and wait. But let me say a personal thank you, and what a wonderful trawl. I'm sure that Michiel Rademakers will come up with a question too about Midden-Nederland and one or two later Dutch maps. I'm going to make my fortune because I personally know, for past sins, the Crown Prince of Sealand. That's
the
Sealand 10 miles off Harwich.
Yes, that's right. That's the pirate radio station place.
Yeah, and yes. he hasn't got a road map as far as I know. So I shall buy up the entire stock and make my fortune there, I think. But thank you very much. I'm sure there are lots of questions, so I'm going to straight away ask Fraser to unmute.
Yes.
Ask to unmute and fire away, Fraser.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Ian, for an excellent talk. Very enjoyable. I've got a couple of questions for you. Just to take you all the way back to your first slide, you showed us that picture of Swanage, and I was there on Saturday, and it was gorgeous. And that image was by Graham Sutherland. I know that people collect Shell guides and Shell posters, and I think the guides had maps in them. But I was just wondering if there were like standalone maps for British maps pre-war, because a lot of the examples you've shown us are from Europe and the States and Africa, etc.
Yes, partly influenced by the title of Everywhere You Go. I deliberately didn't include any UK maps. The one exception that sneaked through, which wasn't a proper map anyway, was the Shell BP Shilling Guide to Norfolk. Just because I was amused by the different Norfolks again. They issued shall I stop sharing, and would it be easier? Or do you want me to keep sharing in case I want to go back to any of the maps?
Yeah, keep it.
Okay.
Open.
They issued Foldex maps before the war. This is actually a post-war example.
I'm sorry, if you want to show one, do kill.
Well, you can probably see what I'm holding in front of me. It's a red card map with the Shell logo printed on top. The Shell logo is printed in color. It's post-war. Before the war. They did a few Shell Foldex maps with just red and black covers. I I've never researched in any detail on that. I know that the late Tim Nicholson had a way of dating them by reference to, in fact, the publication dates of the shell guides that were referred to on the back of the map, which is like a sort of slightly backwards way of doing it. But I think they were first issued about 37. They didn't issue, unusually, I say unusually, perhaps strangely, they didn't issue any sheet maps of the UK until then, despite the fact that, you know, they were being widely done by shell companies in Germany, USA, Canada, Australia, France, even Dutch East Indies. I've got and actually I've even got one of West Africa in the 1930s. The one exception was they printed literally a few hundred copies of a shell map of Scotland in 38, 39 with George Phillip. Again, just like the shell map of China, if anyone can find one for me, I would love to see one. I have no idea what it was like. Oh, someone scribbled on on the screen. That's interesting.
Oh, wasn't me, Gov.
No, it's you can do that actually. You can annotate screens in Zoom these days. Don't worry, it doesn't it? At the end of the presentation, it'll disappear. Sorry, I've digressed. The Scotland map, I think, was produced in connection with the Glasgow exhibition of 1939. Probably as a freebie to hand out to visiting VIPs or something. But as I said, I have never seen a copy of it, and it was produced in certainly less than 2,000 copies. So all I know is that it appears in the Phillips Day books as a job that they've done.
Okay, thank you, Ian. That's
but then post war, they issued regular series of maps from 52, 53, right the way through to 1990.
I've got one more question.
Go ahead.
If I may, very simple question. Have you estimated the number of maps you have in your collection?
I don't have to estimate it. They're in a database. It's about excluding duplicates. It's about 9,600.
Right.
But the shell maps are about 2,100 of those.
Amazing. Thank you.
And I bet he's never got one in the car when he needs it. Sorry, cheap jibe. Any more questions for Ian, please?
Could I please ask Ian, the maps of the Netherlands? Do you know which cartographer that was used?
Okay, since I've got. Hold on a second. Where's my mouse gone? Mouse. There we go.
Yeah.
The one on the left would CIB Cartographic Institute Bootsma.
Bootsma. Ah, yes, that's a well-known one.
That's right, which merged with Falkplan.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't remember. I think some of the late ones just described as being CIB-Falkplan.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm especially the early one of if I remind properly, that was 1923, and at that time there wasn't a national cartographer. There were only the state maps of the Topographische Dienst.
Topographische Dienst certainly did quite a lot of oil company maps. I will tell you in a moment if it did any shell or not. Actually, I can show you this in a moment. Sorry, I'm trying to be too clever. I'm trying to do something.
Can I do it for you?
No, that's okay. Let's see whether this will work. Yeah, there we go. Oh, it won't work.
were you trying to find an old one of the slides?
No, it's the slide's fine. Yes, I have some that are described as being by Foldex, some by mayors, which would be probably German cross-border issues, and then mainly Bertsma or Falkland, and sometimes described as being Falkland Surland. SW.
Surland. That's also an editor in Holland.
Yeah.
But Volkplan is German.
Yes, I think they acquired Bertsma. I don't have any topographische Dienst from a Shell, but I do have plenty from other
Okay, and I've
other
one thing
companies.
for you about the Breslau maps. Adolf Hitler was replaced by Adam Mickiewicz, a famous patriotic poet.
Thank you. If I had the full map, I could have told. I could have seen that, but unfortunately, I cut in order to get the areas the same. I cut that bit off. So, thank you.
How very peace-like and appropriate. Ian, can I ask you? You've mentioned so many different national cartographic houses. Was there a policy of using the local in general over the years? Was there a policy by Shell of using the indigenous cartography company, or did they just mix and match and put it out?
It was a bit mix and match. By and large, they would do the they would go to a local company if there was a strong local company to use. But where there wasn't, they would tend to fall back typically on George Philip. And then, as I said, the German shell companies quite separately worked with Mayors Geographische for many, many years. And indeed, the one we can see on screen at the moment on the right-hand side, that is a Mayors Atlas inside. It's got it was a version that was not sold under, as far as I'm aware, any different cover. It was only sold under the Shell cover. And it had, as I said, it's got these pages at the front giving you the history of Shell cartography in Germany, which very pointedly, of course, started in 1950, not in the 1920s, where it really did.
So in North America, was it Shell itself before it became a unified, large, what do I call them, oil map producer, and they were just sponsoring other people's maps? Was it that caused the change from general drafting stuff to Gusha, for example?
I mean, the US commercial map industry was dominated from the late 1920s through until the 1980s by three companies, by, as you say, General Drafting Company, by H.M. Goucher, and by Rand McNally, with Rand being slightly the biggest. General Drafting Company only worked primarily for two oil companies. It worked in the earlier years for Mobil, and then, or Mobil Gas, and then all the time right up until the demise of the free road map, it worked for Esso or subsequently Exxon. It didn't work for any other companies. So all the other companies tended to be competing or not compete. So so Goucher and McNally tended to be competing for business with all the other oil companies. Shell tended to use Goucher most of the time. In the 1960s, it briefly sort of flirted with another large printer that had developed a cartographic function, R.R. Donnelly.
Oh, yes.
But Donnelly withdrew from the map business, I think, fairly quickly. And so Shell were primarily with Goucher. But then so were lots of other companies. But Shell maps were produced to their specification. So
Right.
if you open up the inside, it would be a printing that was for Shell.
Yes.
the actual cartography would be pretty much the same as for any other company.
They were very similar, I think, in some of these cartographers in the States were very similar in style, it seemed to me. I inherited a box of maps that was put together by a good TV friend, Richard King, who in his youth, I think it was 1971, they did the first round the world trip in a British double-decker bus. And he had a complete set of, unfortunately, he lost some territories to a sneak thief, but he had a collection of road maps from Kent to Australia overland, barring one ship trip, and then right across America. And one of these maps was about 6 foot long, compiled by the police department, and you're going to ask me which state it was. I'll have to show you. It marked every low bridge and prohibited road to double deckers, which from Britain were always over height. But what struck me indexing this lot, a horrible job. You'd have loved it, but I found it very monotonous, indexing many dozens of these things. But next time we meet, I must show you what I have. I've only disposed of the most grotty, oil-soaked, weather-stained versions, but you might like to see what he brought back. There's an interesting mix of territories, a lot of Australia, a lot of America, and a little bit in between. Anyway, I mustn't hog things. Any more questions for Ian, please? No, well, that's it. It falls to me to say with great pleasure, thank you formally, Ian, for a splendid world tour of not only places, but map styles and a fascinating variety of what we always think of as a good old single Anglo-Dutch company.